For tapes of end-time meetings, deliverance services, or Lake Hamilton Bible Campground's publication, Voices from His Excellent Glory, Declaring the Kingdom, writes Post Office Box 21516, Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, zip 71903.
Our website is www.lakehamiltonbiblecamp.com and lhbconline.com. There are many free audio files there. It's like going to Bible school at home.
Sunday evening, May the 30th, 1982. Memorial Weekend Seminar being held at Lake Hamilton Bible Campgrounds, Hot Springs, Arkansas. Speed Wilson, Colonel Speed Wilson, Marine Corps retired, is the speaker of the evening. His topic, the International Monetary Group.
Well, tonight we want to undertake a sometimes controversial subject, the International Money Group, and we cannot call it a conspiracy because they're open and public about it. A conspiracy has to be secret, although most of their meetings and plans in depth are secret, but there's much information available on this once I became aware of it back in 1968 when I was working in Washington, D.C., and had become quite confused in the Korean operation because we had that war won 3 times in 1950 to 51 when I was there, and each time we had it won, we were told to blow up our ammunition and retreat or withdraw. And then when I began to work for Mr. McNamara, I began to understand that they were doing exactly the opposite of what we ought to be doing if communism was really our enemy. And these people are not stupid, they're extremely brilliant, so I knew there had to be something behind it, and so I began to research, and then I was totally amazed at the mass of information that was available once I became aware of what was going on. Now, the Bible makes it very clear that there will be a one-world government and a one-world economic system functioning and established before the coming of the Son of Man. We talked about that in The End of the Age and the Coming of the Son of Man, and a general title, Knowing the Times and Seasons. And this system will become manifest in the open between right now, 1982, and then I would see its collapse beginning of, or be more apparent, I don't know if it's collapse, somewhere around 1997 to the year 2007, somewhere in that range. Now, the Lord warned us in Matthew 10:16 that He sent us forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Have you ever felt like that? So He's warned us to be as wise as serpents, at least as wise as that old serpent, the devil, but as harmless as doves. So please don't try to harm someone with the information that we give tonight, and share only as the Lord might lead. We Christians have been accused of being so heavenly minded we're no worldly good. Well, I don't accept that. I think the Christian should be the best informed individual around, and I believe the Christian should be very active in all aspects of government, everything else, as the Lord leads. And thank God there are many people today who are born again and filled with the Holy Spirit who are seeking public office. It's long time overdue, and we let Satan run this show much too long because we've been taught foolishly that we weren't to get into that type of operation. Well, if you don't, somebody else will. And God knows the beginning from the end of the beginning, and don't ever forget. And I wish we had a big sign to put up here. God has everything under control. Hallelujah. And ever since you accepted the Lord, you're no longer an accident looking for a place to happen. You're in His control too. James 1:5 says, if any of God's people lack wisdom, they can ask God, and He will give them wisdom liberally, and He won't upbraid them. He won't call you dummy because you ask. And 2 Timothy 2:7, the Lord gives His people understanding in all things. And, of course, we've quoted Hosea 4:6 and Isaiah 5:13. My people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. And God would not have us ignorant, as we've mentioned many times, 9 times in the New Testament alone. Now, some of the scriptures we'll be giving in a minute will show you that there is to be a one-world government and a one-world economic system. So God has said it, and that settles it. And if we're at the end of an age, which I am convinced we are, then we would be seeing this coming to pass. And I'm not here to determine whether or not this is good, bad, indifferent, or whatnot, although I see the spirit behind it is definitely the spirit of Antichrist. but God has that in control also. I see most of the people here functioning somewhat like Judas. Remember, Jesus said that he had lost none except Judas Iscariot, that Scripture might be fulfilled. And so Judas did fulfill that. And we also find in Jeremiah 25:9 that the Lord actually called Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And he used Nebuchadnezzar as his servant to discipline the nation of Israel, and that he would destroy Jerusalem. And he did, 585 B.C. Now here are a few of the scriptures. Isaiah 9, chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, written 700 B.C., 2,700 years ago. For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government, singular, the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, and the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. That would certainly be the Lord Jesus Christ. And of the increase of his government and his peace there will be no end, to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth and forever and ever, and the power of the Lord of hosts will perform it. So God signed it, and he's going to do it. Daniel 7, verses 13, 14. In a vision I saw the Son of Man come with the cloud of heaven. Sounds like Thessalonians, doesn't it? And there was given unto him dominion and glory, and a kingdom, singular, consisting of all nations and all languages, shall serve him. And his dominion, that's his rule and reign, is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom shall never be destroyed. I like that term of office for the Lord, forever and ever. Revelation 11:15, and the seventh angel sounded, that's apparently the last trumpet, and there was a great voice in saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and his anointed ones, the saints, and they shall rule forever. Revelation 20, verse 4 repeats that. Daniel 7:18, the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Same typology. Well, we don't need to review what we've already talked about on the end of the age type thing. But some time ago, it was in Vienna in Austria, in April 1979, they had a meeting of what we would call the Bilderbergers. We'll come back to them a little later on. But this is pretty recent. And the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, he's still the Secretary General, Joseph Luns, and he's a member of a half a dozen, or about 3 or 4 of the international organizations. He said, the steady advancing unity of Europe is the most promising guarantee of our ideals and objectives for a one-world government. Now, the motivation for this whole group is very clear in the Bible. It's 1 Timothy 6:10. The love of money and the power that it brings is the cause or root of all evil. It is not money, it's the love of money. Because if you love money more than anything else, you violated the first and great commandment, you have another God. And you'll see that money will crop out in all of their titles. The unity of Europe, as Lund spoke of, the European Common Market, money. They don't call it that, they call it the European Economic Community, the EEC, economic, money. All of the nations, so forth. Daddy Rothschild wrote in 1810, if you'll give me control over a nation's money, I don't care who makes its laws. In other words, he runs the show if he controls the money. They control the wealth and the economic systems of the world right now very well. And we find in Revelation 13:17 that they'll finally be able to do away with money, and they will control the computers that will act as money. It says this, and all, both small, great, rich, poor, free and bond, now that's everybody on the face of the earth, not just the United States, could not buy nor sell without a mark, that is, a number, an embossment, or an engraving. You could translate the word mark either of those 3 ways. And we've covered that in a message we gave here the last time we were here of buying and selling with a number. And we talked about in our talk on Bible numerics, we mentioned the book briefly, Theomatics by Lucas and Washburn, published by Stein and Day. on page 180 and page 181, they show very clearly that the Revelation 13:18, number 666, and 2 Thessalonians 2nd chapter, verse 3, the man of sin, the son of perdition, refers to a system and not a person at all. However, they said the person could represent that system, of which I am convinced they're correct. And we talked about him at the conclusion of the Bible numerics. So it's very clearly an end-time system. And we also have a talk entitled Mr. 666, if you were interested in the details of, in addition to just his numbers, his name adding up. Now, the International Money Group began really in Babylon, an Antichrist city and a horrible abomination to the Lord, anti-God system. They had central banking for the first time in mankind's history, and they perverted all religions, including the Talmud of the Hebrew and all of the other things that are handed down through many of the denominations today. Now, but it came the modern system. Now, it's the same spirit. You'll have to remember that the Antichrist spirit pervades this whole system. Now, there's a family by the name of Meyer or Bauer, but they preferred to be called Rothschild, Rothschild. And they'd pretty well controlled the world money system as it existed in the late 1700s, early 1800s. But there was a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt, 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 claimed to be a Jew, and he was an ordained priest in the Roman Catholic Church, and was an high representative as a warlock, or if you prefer, witch. And he realized he'd gone as far as he could go in that operation, so he ceased to be a Roman Catholic priest and joined up with Robespierre for the French Revolution and a lot of other Satan worshippers at that time. And he began to realize that if he was going to gain more occult power, he had to get his hands on 3 books. The Kabbalah, K-A-B-A-L-A, and the other book, the Minor Key of Solomon, and the other book, the Major Key of Solomon. And he found that the Rothschilds possessed those 3 books. So he approached the Rothschilds, and they combined with the Rothschilds Satanism with Cabalistic crafts, and they formed their own private occult coven called the Golden Dawn. And it is still the private coven of the upper echelons of the International Money Group. That occurred on the first day of May, 1776. Now you know why all the Antichrist organizations celebrate May Day. It certainly was a puzzle to me as to why the Russian or the communist always celebrated May Day when their revolution was the 17th of October, 1917. Now I know. It's the Antichrist system that brought them into being that they celebrate May Day. First day of May, 1776, is the birthday of the occult god Baltane, B-A-L-T-A-N-E, literally meaning the God of Light. And they called their organization the Illuminati, literally meaning the light bearers. The Bible prophesies this, 2 Corinthians 11:14 in the New Testament. Satan himself being transformed into an angel of light, Baltane. In the early 1920s, the Rothschilds combined with the Rockefellers, or vice versa, and started putting themselves together for this world organization. I want to review some of the names of this organization worldwide. Illuminati, often masquerading now under the name Moriah, or an annex or sometimes a planning group of that would be the Club of Rome. By the way, the Club of Rome and the Illuminati finance witchcraft and Satan worship all over the world. Get a copy if you don't believe it. First time I found that was Mike Warnke's book, Satan Seller. And he was a priest in the order of Satan, and he pointed out the Illuminati financed all their operations. Another organization is the Bilderbergers. Dr. Redinger, a Polish philosopher, had arrived at the conclusion that world opinion or public opinion follows the lead of certain individuals. And he felt that he could contribute to control of the world by picking out those individuals. And he shared it with Prince Rerenhard. Prince Rerenhard is the Prince of the Royal Dutch Netherlands, the husband of Queen Juliana. He also turns out to be the president of Shell Oil Company, North American Phillips Electronics, the largest in the world, and the president of the largest chemical corporation in the world, Unilever. Poor fellow has a pretty nice-sized petty cash fund. And he generally has one of his representatives running the International Monetary Fund, but we'll come to that later on. So in 1954, they gathered 80 of the world's leaders together, 20 of them Americans, into a hotel called Bilderberger. Included in those 20 Americans were names you would recognize as David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. And some of today's better-known members of the Bilderbergers would be Gerald Ford, former President of the United States, and the present Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher. Well, in England, it's known as its offshoot is the London. Before I forget, I've never been able to associate Pierre Trudeau of Canada. He is not listed as a member of any of these organizations, but he attends a lot of their meetings. He's sort of a Ted Kennedy gone north. But in London, in England, it's known as the London Royal Institute of International Affairs. Get the title, which is an outgrowth of the old Fabian Society. Probably one of the most familiar names that was a member of the Fabian Society was Joe Kennedy, the father of the Kennedy brothers. And then in France, it is the Institute of French International Affairs. See, the title International Affairs is in there. So that's who does the thinking for it. Now, none of these organizations are elected to do the thinking for the people which finagle around and get elected. In the United States, the Council on Foreign Relations, founded in 1923, its chairman is David Rockefeller. Its director and president is Winston Lord. In 1979, Winston Lord was being interviewed about the Trilateral Commission, and he got very upset, and he said, the Trilateral Commission does not establish world policy. The Council on Foreign Relations does that. Well, what about the Trilateral Commission? Created in 1973. Now, Mr. Nixon upset a lot of their plans. He and Prime Minister of Japan, I can't think of the dear man's name. But anyway, they teamed up to break out of this whole operation. Although Mr. Nixon was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And they almost did it. So to preclude that from happening again, the David Rockefeller, by the way, David Rockefeller is the chairman of the Trilateral Commission and founder, and its director today. I haven't been able to determine whether it's Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski. Kissinger was born in Germany and Zbigniew Brzezinski born in Poland. We have an international government. And the organization Trilateral meant 3 points of power. Now, 80% of the Rockefeller wealth is outside the United States. Now, if you only knew what their wealth was in the States, you would see how minor we are, but yet how large we are. Just to mention some of their holdings: Chase Manhattan Bank, the Morgan Trust, International Telephone Telegraph, General Motors, and on down the line, and they're taking over savings and loans companies as fast as they can force them into bankruptcy, and small banks too. If you know someone that has a small bank and it's in good shape now, it'd be a good time to get out of the business, because they're going to wipe them out just like they did independent oil companies in 1973 and following. So they got members in the United States and Canada. They treat the United States and Canada and North America as one unit. And in the common market, particularly West Germany, was the second one, and Japan was the third one. Now, that would almost account for the remaining 60% of the Rockefeller wealth and about another 20 or 30% in Central America and around over the world. So each of those tries were to have 60 members, for a total of 180. And here are some of the charter members of the Trilateral Commission that you would remember. fellow by the name of Jimmy Carter, Marvin Mondale, and Zbigniew Brzezinski was the director at that time. And of the original 60 American members of the Trilateral Commission, Jimmy Carter had 32 of them as his cabinet members. That's quite a coincidence, I would think. And another organization, the Atlantic Council. That's a coordinating system for the exploitation of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's generally headed up by Elliot Richardson. Remember that name. You'll be hearing of him some more, I am convinced, in politics. One of the most recent organizations is the Pacific Basin Institute, founded in 1979, consisting of the 20 major nations in the Pacific area, and they're getting ready for the exploitation of the Pacific area, and that's the reason we have friendly relations with Red China, etc. today. And then the Commission on Critical Choices for Americans. Isn't it nice that they will decide what choices you should make? The chairman of that, before he met an untimely demise, was Nelson Rockefeller. And under that would come the Brookings Institute. You'll hear that reported in the news, and they'll tell you what to think. And the Aspen Institute, which directs all the humanistic studies and have instituted the humanistic teachings in our churches and in our schools to replace and do away with Christianity. And then the National Council of Churches. Some people are surprised to find out the Rockefellers founded and funded the National Council of Churches. If you're critical on that, there's a great big book, about 600 pages, written by David Horowitz, and the Rockefeller family gave him access to their files, and you'll find that documented on page 151, the Rockefeller Dynasty. And they, meaning the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, also support the World Council of Churches, and the head of the World Council of Churches is a Russian general from the KGB. That's the Russian CIA. A devout Christian, no doubt. The National Council of Churches gives funds to every communist organization in the world. One branch of the Presbyterian Church and the Salvation Army got out of the National Council of Churches a few years ago because they were not allowing their money to go to the destruction of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, another communist annex. And there also, anytime the National Council of Churches represents anything, saying it in the news media, you know you've heard straight from Antichrist. And ditto for the World Council. And how do they direct and control money? Now, that isn't a complete list of their organizations, but that's enough to give you an idea. They direct and control the money in the United States through the Federal Reserve Board. Created under Woodrow Wilson's administration, came into existence the 23rd of December, 1913. If you've ever been around Washington and fooled around with Congress and the Senate, you'd know that the 23rd of December is an unusual date for legislation to be passed, because most everybody's left town around then for Christmas time. Well, they planned it that way. Only their trusted agents waited around, and a group called the Warburgs got together, drafted some legislation they call the Federal Reserve Act. That's not too unusual. That's done quite often. The dairy associations, labor unions, all the others, they draft legislation, and if they can get somebody to introduce it in the Congress or the House, well, then they vote on it and so forth. Nothing unusual that part. But Woodrow Wilson, being a lackey of the International Money Group, knew that the group that waited in town was the group to be trusted, so he called a special session, and before any of them could get back to Washington, D.C., they'd voted the Federal Reserve Act into existence in violation of the Constitution of the United States. They took the control of currency and interstate commerce away from the Congress. The Constitution still reads that way, that the coining and printing of money shall be reserved unto the House of Congress, period. So it's unconstitutional, but the Constitution and law, you'll find, do not apply to these people. So that was the gaining control, the Federal Reserve. If you don't know it, the Federal Reserve tells the banks how much money they can loan. It tells them how much interest they can charge, and it has absolute control. It also tells our government how much money we can have in circulation at any one time. That's M1, and the credit and paper money is M2, and they balance that formula, and they control the whole system. It wasn't many years ago. Used to a bank to be the member of the Federal Reserve was voluntary, but it isn't anymore. All banks are now under the control of the Federal Reserve, headed up by Paul Volcker. We'll come back to Mr. Volcker later on. He has an interesting biography with a lot of Rockefeller blood in it. And the world Under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another lackey of the International Money Group, probably did more to the destruction of the United States economic system than any single man thus far. Jimmy Carter may run a pretty close one in the future. We'll see what he did. They created the International Monetary Fund, affectionately known as IMF, one of the most beautiful buildings in town. And according to the Vice President of Marriott, born-again, Holy Spirit-filled Christian, but when they found out about that, he's no longer with Marriott. Mormons couldn't stand that. So they got rid of him, but he said, if you want some good food, you ought to eat over to IMF. They live rather well. International Monetary Fund. Controlling, it works like the Federal Reserve. If you'll check the money in your hip pocket, if it'll fold, if it's paper money, it's a Federal Reserve note. Absolutely nothing behind it, not even peanuts, nothing, just a piece of paper, and whatever you can get at the grocery store anywhere else is all it's worth. And that's all, and it's getting worth less and less and less. If the dollar was worth $1 in 1948, it's worth 23 cents today, 1982. No wonder Christian ministries are in trouble. When they pass the offering plate around, somebody throws in $1 and thinks they gave something. That's like throwing in a quarter. If you're going to give $1, you're going to have to give $5 now. But we got to wake up to that fact. And you might as well start doing it, because one of these days you may wake up some Monday morning, you'll find out that all that folding money you got in your pocket's no good. You've been told to go to the nearest bank and pick up the new currency, and for every 10 you turn in, you'll get 1 in return. Or maybe for every 100 you turn in, you'll get 1 in return. You say that won't happen? Go tell it to the Icelanders. It happened in January last year. They had a new currency, and for every 10 they turned in, they only got 1 in return. Well, it's good for the government or Rockefeller. Oh, yeah, 1948 and 1923 is worse than that. 1923, well, I don't want to get into the German operation, but, yeah, it happens. And I've been, well, you know, I got too much talk about stuff on that. The International Monetary Fund is the same way. Mr. Paul Volcker at that time was the Assistant Secretary of State for Monetary Affairs, and Mr. Paul Volcker developed the special drawing rights in the International Monetary Fund, and it's like the Federal Reserve note. It's absolutely worthless, but the Federal Reserve draws interest on it. Isn't that a neat rip-off? Well, the same thing with the International Monetary Fund. If a nation can borrow some money from them, as England did a couple of years ago, they borrowed $3 or $4 billion at 3% or 4%, somewhere along there, and they really didn't get any money. All they got was special drawing rights, SDRs. Sounds like FDRs, doesn't it? SDRs. But they draw interest on it. It's just a number on a piece of paper, but they draw interest on it. Rip-off, you call that. Creating money out of nothing and getting paid for it. No wonder they like that job. Well, how do they maintain political control? Well, of the world, the United Nations was founded during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt regime of 1945. By the way, they tried this with the League of Nations, and there were quite a few people in the United States waked up to what was going on. And most of all, some of the rebels in Russia found out what was going on, and the League of Nations collapsed. So they had to try again in 1945 and got it through and got the United Nations. And then, of course, the European Economic Community. And within the European Economic Community, you'll find the Bilderbergers. And within our operations here in the United States, you'll find the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Those are strictly political type things. Economic control. This is how they developed into this whole operation. The eldest, the old man Rothschild, or Daddy Rothschild, wrote, as I said a minute ago, in 1810 in his memoirs, he says, "Give me control over a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." Well, through an interesting manipulation in England, and I see the Rothschilds were backing both England and Napoleon. They really sort of thought Napoleon was a neat way to gain control of the whole operation, but Napoleon decided that once he got control of the whole operation that he would run it himself. So they had to get rid of him, and if we had time, it was interesting to me as a military man as the tactics they used to get rid of Napoleon. Of course, Lord Nelson thought he did it, but he didn't. They rigged the show on him. On the 18th of June, 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. And through a set of carrier pigeons, Nathan Rothschild in London, who was sitting at the World Market at that time. They didn't have Wall Street at that time, but the World Market, Nathan was the eldest of 5 Rothschild sons. And through these carrier pigeons, remember, they didn't have telephones, radio, television, satellite. They didn't have all that in 1815. And so these Rothschild pigeons were carrying messages back and forth between the continent and England, So Nathan Rothschild in England would know sometimes 48 hours ahead of time of events that had occurred on the continent of Europe. That's like having Monday morning's Wall Street Journal today, so that you can read the stock market and you do rather well. Well, they did rather well. So he knew 30 hours before anybody else that Napoleon had been defeated, and now there would be no stopping the British Empire in its conquest and exploitation of the world. So the next morning, on the 19th of June, 1815, Nathan Rothschild walked into the world market and calmly started selling the British Treasury notes. They had quite a few. They called them consols in those days, and he started selling. Now, I want you to realize that this character is doing the exact opposite of what logic would tell you to do if you were playing the stock market legitimately. But he's smarter than that, and they do it today. No, he knows something they don't know. So he's selling. And these people all know that this guy never makes any mistakes. So they figure that England is on its way out. So everyone starts selling their consols. And if you fool around the stock market when everybody's selling and nobody's buying, the bottom falls out and they become worthless. And just before the stock market closed, Nathan Rothschild bought the British Empire with what he had taken off of the top. So they had control of the British Empire 19 June 1815. They gained control of the United States 23rd of December 1913, Federal Reserve Act. Interesting, in a job I had at the time, one of my additional duties was to scan the congressional record every day, every morning. I had to get there around 6 o'clock in the morning to scan the congressional record to see what had happened, if anything happened that would have any impact on the Defense Department, particularly the Marine Corps. And I found it very interesting. In 1969, as I was leafing through it, the congressional record tells you everything that happened in Congress and a lot of things that didn't happen in Congress. But congressmen and senators can have things inserted that really didn't happen. And they can also clean up some of the stuff that did happen that they don't want in there, too. But it's usually pretty honest. It's a record. 1969, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, a dear old man, Wright Patman from Texas, was interviewing a very heated exchange between he and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Mr. Eccles, at that time. And the chairman asked Mr. Eccles, "Do you mean to tell me that the Federal Reserve Board is more powerful than the President of the United States or the United States Congress?" Mr. Eccles replied, "In matters of money and credit, yes, Mr. Chairman." How about that? Remember what Daddy Rothschild said? Give me control over a nation's money, and I don't care who makes its laws. It might come as a shock to you, as it did to me. The Federal Reserve Board is not a part of our government. It is a privately owned corporation. Mr. Wright Patman, Chairman Wright Patman, tried 3 times. He issued a congressional subpoena for the Federal Reserve Board to bring forward their corporate records to determine where the interest on the national debt goes, 3rd largest item in our budget. Today, the interest on the national debt will run somewhere around $200 billion a year, and in 1969, our total budget was $160 billion. And they refused to deliver those records. They'd find them in contempt and fine them a few $1,000s. That doesn't bother them. They pay it with your and my money anyhow. And he got it to the Supreme Court one time, but the Supreme Court, would not hear it. No, because Whizzer White, William O. Douglas, and some others on there at that time were all members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Now you know about the Supreme Court. Anybody can read the Constitution and understand it except the members of the Supreme Court. You can read it, you can understand it. It says very clearly. They talk about this separation of church and state. I almost go nuclear every time I hear that. That's not what the Constitution says at all. The First Amendment says, and I quote, "The government shall not establish a religion nor interfere with the free practice thereof." Period. Didn't say anything about the church staying out of the government. It said the government's got to stay out of the church. And we know who that was aimed at. They just came from England, where the state church was the Anglican church and other places and that type thing. So there's no separation of state and church anywhere in the First Amendment or anywhere else in the Constitution. And by the way, the Constitution guarantees the freedom of religion. It never guaranteed the American Civil Liberties Union or Mary Madeline Murray O'Hare or anybody else freedom from religion. I even know the difference between freedom of and from, but the Supreme Court doesn't. Well, National Geographic magazine, January 74, as I told you, you can see this everywhere, said the price of gold in U.S. dollars is established twice daily in the London Bank of Rothschild. Now, do you understand why the Bible warns you against buying gold in the last days? Zechariah, Zephaniah, and James, and Revelation says don't do it. And if you've got some, hold on for it for a little while, but when it hits $800, get out of the gold as quick as you can. By the way, if somebody told you today you're as sound as a dollar, you'd probably call the ambulance. That's what they've done to us. Well, international bankers and their activities. Business Week, it's a magazine, 12 January 1976, gave us an update on the Rothschild. Had a picture of the surviving Rothschilds on the cover. And it pointed out, well, on page 54, a spokesman for the Rothschilds, probably Edmund D. Rothschild, said, a stronger United States activity is one of the imperatives for our development, not the United States development, for the Rothschild development, for our development. We want to go much further and faster in our investment banking activities in the United States. Now, just 2 years later after he said that, in Dunn's Review, February 79, headline, Foreign Bankers Invade the United States. It pointed out that in 1972 there were only 52 foreign banks in the United States. But by 1977 there were 96 with over 200 branch banks and facilities located throughout the United States. Pat Robertson pointed out the other day, and I've seen it in print since then, that 70% of all the deposits in the large international banks of the United States are foreign deposits. Can you imagine what had happened to those big banks if those foreigners suddenly pulled their money out? By the way, before I forget it, that's exactly the reason the Shah of Iran was ousted. He waked up to what was going on, and he was quietly taking about $20 million of gold every month out of the banks in the United States that he had, because he saw where it was going. And so they had to stop that. So they sent somebody over to get rid of him. I could give you the names of the people that did. William Sullivan was one. He's a hip man for the State Department. And so the government collapsed, and they took the hostages. And they weren't interested in getting the hostages out. Once they got rid of the Shah, then they could freeze all the Iranian assets in the United States and be sure that they got their money out. And that's exactly what they did. They couldn't have cared less about the American hostages. And did you realize that the Ayatollah Khomeini has killed somewhere around 10 times as many people in the last 3 or 4 years and 20 times as many prisoners as the 25 years that the Shah of Iran was ruling? And do you see any demonstrations and newspapers getting upset about that? No, they don't. And besides, the Shah of Ayatollah Khomeini is not the Ayatollah Khomeini who left Iran back in 1950s, because the original Ayatollah Khomeini had his right index finger missing, and this guy's got all of his fingers. If you don't believe it, see the pictures of the CIA. Probably from Russia. Russia's building large bases in Iran right now, getting ready to move into the Middle East. We gave that talk the last time I was here. The United States, Russia, and Israel in Bible prophecy. They'll probably invade Israel before the end of this year, but certainly no later than 1984. It's really great. You ought to read Ezekiel 38 and 39 and some of the other references. A wonderful thing happens to Russia on the way to the United States. They stop off in the Middle East and get clobbered. And by the way, that's what the Falkland Islands is all about. They got about 50% of the NATO Navy off down in the sub-Atlantic down there, the South Atlantic. And the only people that are going to come out on top in that whole operation is the United Soviet Socialist Republic, commonly known as Russia. You can bet the United States will come out on the short end of it, win or lose. Well, Business Week, 10 March 1976, page 51. Baron Edmund D. Rothschild and the Rothschild money purchased control of the Bank of America Corporation, or sometimes known as the California Tri-State Corporation. Any of you Californians heard of that? Probably have. It has more liquid assets than any bank in the whole world. Fortune magazine says it's somewhere around $120 billion. And Edmund D. Van Rothschild said, "We have gained control of this bank to," quote, "handle the development of Asia in the next 20 or 30 years. Now do you understand why we have friendly relations with Communist China and its 1 billion people? They're ready to be raped again. Now do we understand why in 1979 they created the Pacific Basin Institute to exploit those nations as they did Iran and others? But we'll get blamed for it because they'll be our government representatives over there exploiting them, just like we're blamed for what went on in Iran when it was Rockefeller Rothschild, or better known as Aramco, the Arab American oil companies. Well, U.S. News World Report, 1973, David Rockefeller had an article in there. The title of the article was, How to Trade with the Communists. And the secret to trading with the communists was that Chase Manhattan Bank had just established branch banks in Peking and Moscow. Then followed the wheat deal. If we had time to go through that and find it's the biggest rip-off, it really was a rape, because they borrowed the money from us to buy our wheat. They bought it at $1.68 a bushel. We bought it as in the subsidy for $2 a bushel. They sold it on the open market for $4.85 a bushel, and when they realized they bought all of our wheat, then we bought some of it back for $5 a bushel, and they never touched the wheat, and they bought it with our money, which they'll never pay back. How about that? David Rockefeller, watch him again. He just made a speech the other day that none of the controlled news media said anything about, but he visited Zimbabwe, Angola, all of those communist African nations, and he says, we can do business with any nation regardless of its type of government. Well, sure he can. The United States government will guarantee him that he'll be paid off with your and my money if it doesn't work out. Why do I say that? Well, let's take the Panama Canal, for example. People had asked me when that was going on, do you think that we're so stupid as to give them the Panama Canal? I said, we'll not only give it to them, we'll pay them to take it. And we did. Why? Because the Panamanian government, which is bankrupt, owed Chase Manhattan Bank at least $500 million, and there's no way they could get their money out unless we gave them the money to get it, and the money never went to Panama, it went right to Chase Manhattan. About $4 billion that we got ripped off in that, too. And how about Iran and all of that sort of thing? And Poland, just recently, Poland went bankrupt, or would have gone bankrupt, if you and I, as the American taxpayers, hadn't paid the $76 million interest on the Polish loan, and we'll pay it again come Christmas, because it's owed to the Chase Manhattan Bank, Morgan Trust, and that group. So we'll keep going on and on. Well, communism was created by the International Monetary Group. You can read about it in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, a book, or The Warmongers, 1979, by a fellow by the name of Katz. Excellent review, and there's others that Glenn talked about. And why would they do that? Well, it's like this. They realized that if they didn't do something real quick in 1917, you see, the czars had already abdicated and been overthrown. You can see that in War and Peace and some other movies. Or you can read about it if you want to, if you're not reading an International Money Group history book, and they wrote most of them. But you'll find out that a Mr. Kerensky was setting up a democratic government in Russia. He had taken the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights and was going to establish a parliamentary system as the English have, which is, I believe, a better system than we have in the United States. Well, the International Money Group realized if they ever got a democratic government in Russia, then it would be very miserable. Because, you see, in a democratic government, you have to buy too many people to control it. It's very difficult. So that's the reason there are only about 10 or 12 democracies left in the whole world. The United States and communism has done all the rest of them in and put in dictators, so that if the dictator doesn't do what you want him to do, you just shoot him and get another one. So you see why democracies are going. It costs too much to control a democracy, and there's always the chance you'll get another Abraham Lincoln or President Nixon, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Now then we started building up, and of course they found an old fellow by the name of Lenin. That wasn't his real name. But anyway, the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, put in $20 million. Now, in 1917, $20 million is about like $20 billion today. And the group over in Europe, whatever you wanted to call them, their names were, they put in a matching fund, and they financed Lenin and 500 other old revolutionaries. The representative from the United States was a Colonel H.A.U.S., pronounced House, representing Woodrow Wilson. And they got Lenin in, and they overthrew the young democratic government headed up by Mr. Kerensky. Mr. Kerensky died in exile in New York a few years ago. I had the privilege of hearing him talk one time. It was a heartbreaking thing. Now, we built them up militarily strong during World War II, And don't believe that everybody was for building Russia up. No, there were at least 3 generals that I read about in Pentagon extracts. There was a General Wood, who later became president of Sears Roebuck, and he demanded openly, and he wouldn't shut up, that we allow Hitler to go on into Russia and let them kill each other, because they were both our enemies. So, but you would have everybody have you to think that we should have backed Russia. No, he was right. Let them kill each other. And so was MacArthur, but he got the same reward. And so after World War II, the Russians started World War III then to conquer the world, and we don't have time to keep reviewing them, but we've continued to build them up with the United States money and with United States technology. And the biggest truck factory and engine factory in the whole world is the KMA plant, I guess you'd call it, in Russia. And it was built by the Ford Motor Corporation in conjunction with Fiat, and it was financed with, you guessed it, our money, yours and mine. The first payment is not due on that loan for 17 years. And who knows what will be happening in 17 years, and at that time they'll have to pay the horrible interest rate of 3%. Wouldn't you like to have that loan? That's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Export-Import Bank operation. And they created and keep communism strong. See, communism will not work. All we have to do is quit supporting it and it'll die. But they have to keep it going and strong, because if we didn't have a military threat to scare us into the one world government called the United Nations, we'd never do it. Russia never intended to launch a full-scale war on us. I'll just tell you what Lenin wrote in 1917. It says, our purpose is the creation of a worldwide Soviet republic. Any questions? A worldwide Soviet republic. First, we'll take Eastern Europe. They had that by about the end of 1948. Then the masses of Asia. They got that. Thanks. We walked out on Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and they took that. Mainland of China, 1948 and 49. And then we will surround the United States, which will be the last stronghold of capitalism. We will not have to attack the United States. It'll fall into our hands like an overripe fruit. They don't intend to destroy us. They intend for us to surrender. And we probably will, if the Lord didn't step in. It isn't going to work out the way they got it planned. I got news for them, but I don't dare tell them. Well, to set that up a little further, there was a human rights treaty in the United Nations that every president in the United States since 1948 had absolutely refused to sign, because once it becomes a reality, it would do away with the sovereignty of the United States and would be no longer private property. But it was signed on the 5th of October, 1977 by a peanut farmer named James Early Carter. So sometime in the distant future, if things work out, you may know that Mr. Carter was the Judas president. Well, we continue to support Russia. Some people have said we've already surrendered and we're just paying our reparations to them right now, paying our demands. That could be. How do they control information? You know, if you control the information, you control the way people think. Hitler proved that over and over again, and Russia proves it right now. In the news media, they outright control the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, Time, Life, Fortune, People Magazine, Money Magazine, and anything else published by the Time Life Corporation. Oh, the LA Times, too. I wouldn't want to leave the West Coast out. And the Chicago Daily News. Television and radio, CBS, NBC, and they're gaining control of ABC, and I invite you to watch who sponsors the programs on the public broadcasting system. Many large publishing companies are controlled by them. Most all the movie producers are controlled by them. And they control religion, some of it, through the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, through their humanism, and they teach that in most seminaries, most of the mainline denominations. And they control education again through humanism and the Department of Education back in Washington, D.C. No wonder you hear a lot of cries when Mr. Reagan starts talking about getting back to the Constitution. Did you know if we were back to the Constitution says that only the powers relegated, it says no powers here mentioned remain with the states. Well, if you see what remained with the states, the only thing that was assigned to the federal government was to conduct international relations and provide a common defense, period. That's all Washington ought to be doing. but they're running every step of your life. By the way, the collection of the Internal Revenue is unconstitutional. They're taking your money without due process of law. You're guaranteed that you cannot have your property, life, or anything else taken, or freedom taken away without due process. It's all like the Federal Reserve Act. It's just there. By the way, there's a whole bunch of people out in Chicago and everywhere else that haven't paid any income tax, and they're not going to pay any income tax. See, once you pay it, you've entered into a contract. But if you never pay it, it's not binding, and they can't enforce it. Those people are trying to get it. The head of constitutional law at Notre Dame came up with that. Paul Mannion was his name. I thought, man, he is a real nut the first time I heard him in 1961 out in Chicago. He said, you will live to see the day that the only people who will get their constitutional rights are the communists and the criminals, and you law-abiding citizens will have no rights. Have you noticed that? The American Civil Liberties Union is the group for that, and the founder of the ACLU is a hardcore second-generation communist. And just before he died a while back, Reagan gave him the U.S. Citizen Medal. They're the ones that financed Mary Madeline Murray O'Hare and got the prayers out of the schools and all the other things. She's just a tool. By the way, it's a blessing that her son Bill came to know the Lord and is going all over the country telling her what a foolish thing his mother is. Hallelujah. God does have a sense of humor. How do they maintain control of the government? Well, every president we've had since Woodrow Wilson down through Jimmy Carter has been a member of one of these organizations, with the exception of Harry Truman, and he was a 32nd degree Mason, and the Knights of the Templar were originated and infiltrated by the Illuminati. And Masonry, to me, is a false religion, and if it's false religion, you know where it comes from. Mr. Goldwater in 1964. They knew he was a very popular man because everybody in the United States that had any sense at all that ever listened to what he said agreed with what he was saying. So he got nominated as the Republican presidential candidate, but he absolutely refused to allow them to form his cabinet, as they'd always done, out of all of their members, all of their controlees. So what did they do? They just simply pulled the strings on all their news media and made Mr. Goldwater look like a total idiot.
This is the end of Part A. Please play Part B. Thank you. Our website is www.lakehamiltonbiblecamp.com and lhbconline.com. There are many hundreds of free audio files there. It's like going to Bible school at home. Thank you.
For tapes of end-time meetings, deliverance services, or Lake Hamilton Bible Campground's publication, Voices from His Excellent Glory, Declaring the Kingdom, writes Post Office Box 21516, Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, zip 71903.
Our website is www.lakehamiltonbiblecamp.com and lhbconline.com. There are many free audio files there. It's like going to Bible school at home.
Sunday evening, May the 30th, 1982. Memorial Weekend Seminar being held at Lake Hamilton Bible Campgrounds, Hot Springs, Arkansas. Speed Wilson, Colonel Speed Wilson, Marine Corps retired, is the speaker of the evening. His topic, the International Monetary Group.
Made Mr. Goldwater look like a total idiot. In fact, Mr. Goldwater, a dear old man, heard him say one time in a private conversation, he said, after I watched the radio and the television and read the evening news, I almost voted for Johnson, too. Yeah. Even the people that killed him, assassinated him, Cronkite and Brinkley and that bunch, I think it was David Brinkley said afterward that if the truth were known, 97% of the people agreed with everything that Goldwater was saying. But the news media wasn't telling you what he was saying. They were telling you what they would interpret for you. By the way, he said the Social Security system, if it wasn't adjusted, would be broke within 10 years by 1974. And it was, but they adjusted it, and now it's broke. And they went around and saying that he would do away with the Social Security system. Remember? One candidate would do away. No, he said, let's make it solid. He's made some really outstanding remarks. I hated to learn the other day that he's not going to run for re-election. Well, International Monetary Fund, here's how they maintain control. Mr. Witteveen, a witch, Business Week calls him a powerful occult mystic. He was running all the investments of the International Monetary Group all over the world. And Pierre Schweitzer was the head of the he was the director of the International Monetary Fund a few years back. So Witteveen became director of the International Monetary Fund, and Pierre Schweitzer took over all of Witteveen's responsibilities as serving on the boards of all of Prince Berenhardt's corporations and all the others. Trusted agents change his jobs. Well, let's look at the World Bank. Robert McNamara, another trusted agent. He stepped down from being president of the World Bank early in the, Carter appointed A.W. Clausen to take his place. I found out who A.W. Clausen was. A.W. Clausen was the president of the Bank of America Corporation. And then I wondered where Mr. McNamara would go. It's no mystery. He's now the president of the Bank of America Corporation. Trusted agents changing jobs. National Security Council, that's the group that runs the White House. You might remember some of the names, Walt Whitman Rostow, McGeorge Bundy, some of those. They're always the powerhouse. They're in the White House to make sure that whoever the president, whoever the guy is who thinks he's the president, find so that he doesn't do anything that would be contrary to the interest of the International Money Group. So in the National Security Council, we find Henry Kissinger. He was replaced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the director of the Trilateral Commission, both of them professors from Columbia University. That's a dead giveaway if they're from Columbia University, because remember, that's where they parked Eisenhower, made him president of Columbia University, so they could get you used to thinking of something other than a smiling general. He was also a tool of the International Money Group and held all of his troops out so that the Russians could move in. A man by the name of George Patton didn't know that he wasn't supposed to win wars, and he would not stop, and they finally had to run over him with a 6x6 truck and killed him. That's how George Marshall died. George Patton. And also killed General Alman over in Korea the same way. They don't have much imagination. They do the same thing over and over again. Well, then the commander of NATO, when Mr. Haig became chief of staff of the White House, he replaced a Rumsfeld, and Rumsfeld became the chief of staff of the White House. See, again, Rumsfeld was the ambassador to NATO, so Rumsfeld came to be chief of staff of the White House, and Haig went over to take over command of NATO. They traded jobs. And then to take over in the Army, recently when Mr. Haig retired from commander of NATO, General Rogers, who was a Rhodes Scholar, chief of staff of the Army, dead giveaway, isn't it? Rhodes Scholar. That would be Fulbright and the Secretary of State, forgotten his name now, a whole bunch of them Rhodes Scholars, because Mr. Rhodes made his fortunes in diamonds and gold, and that's where the nation Rhodesia was named. He figured he wanted his name to live forever, so they named a nation after him because they never changed names. Well, the joke's on him. It's now Zimbabwe. And the chief of staff of the Army, Rogers, was replaced by General E.C. Meyer, who is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and also came from the Brookings Institute. By the way, the Secretary of the Navy today, Lehman, is also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, and then, of course, the White House and the Nixons, we've covered Haig and his opportunities there. Well, let's talk about some of these personalities. I think you ought to know some of these folks. Robert McNamara's full name is Robert Strange McNamara. His background, he was well known in the Ford Motor Corporation as the individual who designed the Edsel. A great success. In fact, it was so successful they realized he had a natural talent, so they sent him to be Secretary of Defense, because his job was to destroy the military power of the United States. In other words, to produce another Edsel. It took him 7 years, and he spanned 3 separate administrations. That ought to tell you that this is really nonpartisan. 7 years, 3 times as long as anyone else. By the way, the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, found out what was going on, and he was beginning to blow the whistle on this whole operation, and they had him committed to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for observation and pushed him out of the 16th floor. You can read about it in the Pentagon case. That's the reason Mr. Nixon wasn't about to go out to Bethesda. He knew it was a one-way trip. Well, Ford Motor Company, Secretary of Defense, and President of the World Bank, and now he's the President of the Bank of America Corporation. One time he was appearing before the Senate Armed Forces Committee. Dear old brother F. Dirksen, a born-again Christian from Illinois, was on that committee, and they were questioning Mr. McNamara about his positiveness and some of the stupid things he had done, but he insisted they weren't stupid, and finally Mr. McNamara got angry, and he says, "You know, I can never remember in my whole life of ever really making a mistake." Well, somebody asked Senator Dirksen about it, and dear old Ev, in his best drawl, senatorial voice, he says, "Well, I notice he doesn't like to talk about the Edsel very much." And And he says, we're all well aware of who appointed him, but I am deeply concerned about who anointed him. He knew who anointed him straight from the pit of hell. And when the Congress forced him to spend the money that they were appropriating for defense, the executive branch literally means they're to execute whatever the Senate and Congress passes. Executive, executive. But they wouldn't do it. Started way back with Wilson of the General Motors Corporation, Secretary of Defense. He wouldn't spend the money. So when they forced him to spend it, he made us buy airplanes that wouldn't fly, the F-111. Had to fire a lot of admirals and generals and colonels that finally let them buy it. And they lost most of them over in Vietnam, never got out of the perimeter of the airfield. And the M16 rifle, which was a miserable weapon, still is a miserable weapon. All the military wanted to buy the Stoner rifle. Thank God the Israelis are now producing it. It's an outstanding rifle. And then in South Vietnam, we betrayed them when Senator Kennedy, McGovern, Church, and Bai and Javits passed a bill stopping any further support of the Southeast Asia Treaty operations, and South Vietnam collapsed. Billy Graham says somewhere in the vicinity of over 6 million people have been killed since 1975, since we abandoned our friends in Southeast Asia. Do you see any of these people like James Fonda and Ramsey Clark and that group demonstrating about that? Nope. They have the same spirit as the communists have. It's called Antichrist, the Bleeding Hearts, the humanistic group. I was really interested one time. I had to go over to twice a year I had to go over to the Hill. I was Deputy Director of Marine Corps Reserve, responsible for the equipping, training, and mobilization of 250,000, 250,000 to 300,000 Marine reservists located at over 300 training centers throughout the United States. So I'd have to go over twice a year to appear before the Senate and then over in the House Armed Forces Committee. But our budget is so small that it was very easy. I'd have it all written out and send it over and ask them if they, when I got there, I said, you have the report before you. Mr. Chairman, do you have any questions? And they usually say, no, Colonel Wilson, and if you can't get by, just let Bill know. That's his administrative assistant, because our budget is so small they drop it off when they round off the DOD budget anyway, because there's only one Marine for every 20 other people in the armed forces. And besides I don't need to get into the internal politics of it. But it just turned out that some of the people that worked for both the Senate and the House Committee had general's commissions in the Marine Corps Reserve, you know. They're not dumb. And I got over there, and McNamara had just finished his dog and pony show. Dr. Enthoven's the dog, and Volz is the pony. And he had all his charts and everything there. And when I got there, he was just winding up, and he says, Mr. Chairman, to Mendel Rivers, grand old man from South Carolina, says, Mr. Chairman, do you have any questions? He said, no, Mr. Secretary, I do not. But I am fascinated with your maneuvering of figures. He said, I am convinced that you could show with your figures that if a man had one foot in the fire and the other foot in a bucket of ice, that on the average he'd be comfortable. Everybody thought it was funny except Mr. Secretary. Well, McNamara's mission, as we've already discovered, and he attained that, and Russia became the single dominant military power in 1972. Well, let's talk about Heinz Alfred Kissinger. He's well known as Henry, but Heinz Alfred is his real name. He was a professor at Columbia University, remember Eisenhower and that group. Then he became Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller's confidant and employee. Then he met Mr. Nixon in 1967, and he became Mr. Nixon's director, National Security Council, just so the Rockefeller interest would be served. And he later became Mr. Nixon's Secretary of State and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In that same year that he got the Nobel Peace Prize, so did the president of North Vietnam, got it for invading South Vietnam. I'll name you some other Nobel Peace Prize winners. Khrushchev, Fidel Castro, and I better stop there because, well, I won't. I'll just tell you. Martin Luther King. And I'm convinced the communists killed Martin Luther King because he had seen that he'd been used, and he said, I've been to the mountaintop, and I'll be used no longer. 2 days later, he was dead. But they'll blame it on the rednecks, so quote. The communists do that all the time. They've done it repeatedly. When somebody finally wakes up to what's going on, is going to spill the beans on them, they kill them. Well, the director, and then he became the director of the Trilateral Commission when Zbigniew Brzezinski took his place in the White House. And then he became director of international matters for Chase Manhattan Bank. That's where he is today. And he's the only man in the whole world who belongs to all 6 of the International Money Group's top policy organizations. David Rockefeller only belongs to 3, and he's chairman of 2. In 1980, Mr. Kissinger was asked about the Trilateral Commission and the Council of Foreign Relations, and they asked him the point-blank question: does the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission run the world? Mr. Kissinger said, no, I can do that very well all by myself. Modest little fella. When they unveiled his portrait over in the State Department, he says that'll do very well until they put it on Mount Rushmore. Well, let's talk about Alexander Haig. You might remember that name, our Secretary of State. He had a doctor's degree, Ph.D., in international relations from Columbia University. Became Deputy Director, National Security Council under Mr. Kissinger. When he became eligible to be a colonel, about 18 years of service, he was already a 2-star general. He was a major general. When Kissinger became Secretary of State, Haig became Director of National Security Council and began to run the White House, and was promoted directly from 2-star to 4-star. He never put on a 3rd star. It's never happened in all history. Even the Washington Post was a little surprised at that. They're limited by the number of 4-star generals they can have, so they forced a born-again, Holy Spirit-filled General Ralph Haynes off of active duty and got his 4 stars and put them on General Haig. When Watergate occurred, General Haig became Civilian Haig, and he was destined to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but Watergate, they needed a chief of staff over in the White House to be Nixon's jailer, and he became Civilian Haig. He has 22 years of active duty, and as a 4-star general, Marine Corps, you wouldn't even be considered till you had about 25, and you get your 1st star. They're going to pick 11 out of 150 in the Marine Corps to be brigadiers each year. Competition's a little heavy. And so then Civilian Haig, after Mr. Nixon resigned, then Civilian Haig again became General Haig. Isn't that neat? He again became General Haig, 4 stars, and was assigned the commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And today he is our Secretary of State. He is Kissinger's patsy. And, of course, Richard Allen, Reagan's first Director of National Security Council, was not a member of the team. And so I knew, and I told people, watch him because he'll have to go. He's not on the team. And they ribbed up a totally unimportant thing over a $1,000 honorarium that he had even forgotten about, and all the others. And they ruined him and forced him out and put the Deputy Secretary of State Clark in. So now Kissinger is both Secretary of State and Director of National Security Council by proxy. And he visits the White House at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, just to see that everything's going all right. President Jimmy Carter was computer selected. I thought that was really interesting. I had to find out that through a French intelligence source. Averill Harriman, on a big think tank up on Hudson Bay, decided, why should we spend a lot of money to get these people all elected when we could just pick out somebody that everybody would like and he would do what we wanted him to do anyway? So they went to Washington and collected all the bylaws and objectives of all the powerful lobbies and put them all in a computer. And the evangelicals are pretty powerful in Washington. So then they printed out a profile of an individual that everybody would like. And sure enough, he had to be born again, although Gerald Ford has a beautiful testimony of how he became born again. I've heard him 3 times at full gospel meetings. But they blew it up that Jimmy Carter had been born again and all the others, and so that's how we got Jimmy Carter as our president. Some people wanted to know how Carter and Fritz Mondale, how did Grits and Fritz ever get together? Well, they're both members of the Trilateral Commission. Well, what was Watergate all about? It's about time we look at that. President Nixon, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, turned against the International Monetary Group because he found out that he was actually an American before he was international man. In 1971, as near as I can tell, the 15th of August 1971, by an executive order, he stopped the sale of American gold to the central banking system, and they were buying it at $35 an ounce and selling it at $170 an ounce. That didn't make them too happy. Then on the 11th day of September 1971, he made a speech. A prophet of God had said that there was going to be a very important event happen in the international money system on the 11th day of September 1971, so I was watching. And Mr. Nixon did at noon. And here is his closing remarks. He said, quote, As President of these United States, I'm hereby serving notice to the world that we will no longer compete in the international marketplace with one hand tied behind our back. Good day, my fellow Americans. That was a Friday. Monday morning, the dollar had been devalued overseas 30%. It's like every product in the whole United States selling overseas for 30% off, and it almost did the common market in. Oh, and the Prime Minister, remember his name, Prime Minister Tanaka of Japan, I found out later, had done the exact same thing 6 months earlier to the yen, and while he gave him the number 1 punch, Nixon came in and gave him the number 2 punch, and they all balanced out equal, Japan and the United States, and they actually locked Tanaka up on trumped-up charges, and they ruined Mr. Nixon through a totally unimportant event called Watergate. And we'll come to Watergate in a minute. In 1973, he did another thing to him. Now, Watergate is, he's a disgraced man by this time with the news media on him, just like they did Goldwater, and they're really giving him a bad time, distorting the tapes and all that sort of thing, and he's destroyed. But he came on the television in the evening. Remember, we got an oil crisis now, a total rip-off, engineered type reparation. There's no oil crisis. And at the end of that speech, he finished the speech that Heinz Kissinger and Alexander Haig and the others had written for him, and he deliberately put it down, pushed it aside. And he looked square into the camera, and this is what he said. As President of these United States, I shall do everything in my power to make this nation independent of any foreign enemy. He says, no, I mean energy. No, he meant enemy. Any foreign energy source no later than 1980. So help me God. Good night, my fellow Americans. Well, the very next morning, our Secretary of State, or Rockefeller Secretary of State, Mr. Kissinger, called a conference, news conference, and he said, I want you of the media to know that Mr. Nixon's closing remarks of last evening did not meet with my approval. So what? Well, you don't get the picture. He's running the operation. Well, could Mr. Nixon make good on his boast of making us independent of oil? I knew he could because we'd done a study over in the Pentagon in 1972 and found that we had enough known oil-producing reserves within the continental limits of the United States to carry out a 5-year conventional war and meet all essential civilian needs through the year 1982 if we never drilled another well. But we didn't go ask Rockefeller about it. We went over to the United States Geological Survey Bureau and asked Mr. Vincent McKelvey. Well, Mr. Vincent McKelvey made a fatal mistake, almost a fatal mistake, during the 1979 in the Carter administration in an offhand manner at the U.S. National Press Club after he had finished the talk. And they asked him, what are the energy reserves of the United States? What are the known energy reserves? He says, we have enough natural gas for 600 years, enough oil for about 130 years, enough oil shale for 1,500 years, enough coal for about 6,000 years, enough bleeder reactor atomic energy is unlimited, and enough uranium-238 in pellets and in rods, enough to generate the power we need for at least 100 years. 3 days later, Mr. McKelvey was drawing unemployment. Carter fired him. But Representative Sims, Republican of Idaho, had his talk recorded in the Congressional Record, and you can read it for yourself. There are many, many other things, and we've talked about atomic energy this morning just briefly. It's the safest, most ecological, most healthful way of generating electricity known to mankind. Now, everybody listen to Jane Fonda. She is not a scientist. As I understand, she even flunked out of drama school. Well, what happened at Watergate? Well, certainly, something happened over at Watergate. Well, there was a break and entry over there, and they were into Senator McGovern's quarters, and according to their testimony, they were taking pictures of his contribution records, trying to figure out where all this communist money was coming from that was supporting his campaign. They knew the American Dairy Association was paying for his quarters over there, which runs over $500,000 a year. And but they had been in there 3 other times and photographed his records, but didn't get what they wanted or tried to. But there were a couple of double agents, James Magruder and H.O. Hunt, Harold Hunt, and the guy that wouldn't talk, Liddy. They wouldn't talk. But Magruder and Hunt, in testimony before Judge Sirica and the Senator Irwin Committee, both said that James McCord and Alfred Baldwin were double agents working for Senator Kennedy. And they were the ones that arranged for him to get caught. James McCord, after he arranged for him to get caught, turned state's evidence in the criminal world, that's known as spill in your guts and go free. Alfred Baldwin, although he was named, was never called to testify. They were not interested in justice. They were interested in getting rid of Nixon. Charles Colson, our brother in Christ, in 1976, was quoted in the Dallas Morning News, not a controlled media. He said the last 6 months in the White House, Mr. Nixon was literally a prisoner, and his jailer was his chief of staff, Alexander Haig. 15th of January 1979, the U.S. News and World Report, when Mr. Haig announced that he was retiring from the Army to run for president. He was going to retire 1 July 79 and run for the presidency of the United States. The U.S. News and World Report, a house organ for the International Money Group, that's the reason you can read it and get the straight scoop, said, General Haig's role in Watergate crisis was to maneuver Mr. Nixon into resigning. The truth will finally out. Let's look at Watergate in perspective. By the way, there was nothing stolen, although there was a break-in entry. There's about 100 break-in entries every 24-hour period in Washington, D.C. But it was unusual because nothing was stolen and nothing was destroyed. And as the bumper sticker said, nobody drowned in Watergate, Chappaquiddick, question mark. Well, let's look at Nixon versus John Kennedy election. Mr. Nixon won that election because if he'd have got the 26 electoral votes of Illinois, he would have been our president. Mayor Daley of Chicago, that's Harris County, was unable to deliver the Democratic votes. They voted for Mr. Nixon, and so they simply lost all the ballot boxes from Cook County. Somebody pointed out it was about 2 semi-truck loads worth. Probably took a wrong turn at Chappaquiddick Bridge. They really don't have much imagination. Compare that one with Watergate, where no ballot boxes were lost and no elections were rigged. Lyndon Baines Johnson, a congressman from the state of Texas, decided he wanted to be a senator from the state of Texas. So he ran against Coke Stevenson, a former governor, a very popular man who lived in Houston. That's Harris County. And according to you, I was down there as a jet instructor, so I know it firsthand, but I'll quote you a reference. U.S. News and World Report, 6 April 1964, pointed out that in 1948, Lyndon Baines Johnson, out of 2 million votes that were cast, he won the election by 87 votes. And the last 150 people that voted in Jim Wells County voted in alphabetical order, all signed their name in same handwriting and a green ballpoint pen. And at least 15 of them had been dead for over 10 years. Resurrection came early in 48 in Jim Wells County. And the election judge, who thought that was just a little unusual, even for Texas politics, demanded an investigation, and 3 days after his letter landed on a federal judge's desk, the election judge was found dead in his car with his head blown right off of his head, and it was common knowledge in all the counties surrounding Jim Wells that a fellow by the name of George Parr, the Duke of Duval, shot the judge. Compare that one with Watergate, and you never read about it. Let's look at Senator Teddy Bear Kennedy in Chappaquiddick. 5 married men, 1 single man, out with 6 single girls on a routine drunken prowl. Happened all the time, as the people out there said. And one of the girls left with the senator and was going back to the hotel probably, but she never made it. He drove a few distance down a paved road, came to a 90-degree turn. The road went here and went into here. The paved roads turned 90 degrees to the left. He went 90 degrees to the right, drove over a half a mile on a gravel road, drove off a bridge, and the girl drowned. The bridge had been there 15 years. Nobody ran off of it, and the last time I checked, nobody had ran off of it yet. There's a telephone back a half a mile back. He could have called for help, but he didn't. He went back to the motel and fell across his bed. He said he was so tired after swimming the channel against the tide that he didn't wake up until 10 hours later, and he heard that this had already been found out. So he went forward and said that this incident had occurred. Now, he said he was asleep for 10 hours, but isn't it interesting that nowadays when you make a telephone call, it's automatically recorded as from what number it was called and what number it went to, and he made 9 phone calls during his sleep. 2 of them to the single man on the party, and the rest of them to his lawyers. And by the way, when they recovered her body, they found that she probably lived for 4 or 5 hours after the car went into the water, because it goes nose down and there's a big air bubble in the back, and we've found pilots to live in airplanes up to 6 to 8 hours with the air that's in the cockpit. And so she could have been saved. We'll never know what it was because they absolutely refused to perform an autopsy in violation of federal and state law. There should have been an autopsy. He was heard before a jury, or grand jury, and then a jury. The judge heard him really, and they found him guilty of the high crime of leaving the scene of an accident and was given a 2-year suspended sentence, meaning if you don't kill any more secretaries in 2 years, you're okay. Compare that with Watergate, where nobody drowned. Well, The 9th of August, 1974, Mr. Nixon, a broken man, doing the best he knew how for your and my best interest. But he came on television and said, and I wept with him, "I can no longer subject this nation to the torment that will be its fate if I remain its president. Therefore, I must resign as president of these United States. May God be with you. Goodbye, my fellow Americans." Well, I knew somebody had to know that Watergate was totally unimportant. And I kept watching. And sure enough, 1977, a fellow by the name of Victor Lasky, a well-known author, published a book, and it got to 3rd place in the nonfiction category as a bestseller. The title of the book is, "It Did Not Start with Watergate." And he put the facts out that made Nixon look like a glorified saint. And I knew that because I had known a few presidents. And the last lines in the book were this: Watergate was a news media event. It was created. While I was still in uniform, I had to go around over the country and at cocktail parties and other things, people would say, "You're from Washington. Do you think he's guilty?" And I'd say, "Who?" You know, there are a lot of guilty ones in Washington. "Who are you talking about?" They say, "Well, you know, Mr. Nixon." And I'd say, "Well, guilty of what?" And that was always funny to watch their face. They suddenly realized they didn't know what he was guilty of. But he must have at least murdered somebody. No, he wasn't guilty of a cotton-picking thing. In fact, on a national interview, they were interviewing director of the CIA, Mr. Helms, and he's the last honest director they had. And they asked him, don't they, when this was after Mr. Nixon was gone, and he was being invited to France and China and other places, and the question was, don't they know that he's a disgraced man? Mr. Helms said, "Oh, no, everybody outside the United States knows that Watergate was a dirty political trick." You see, they didn't read the Washington Post, the New York Times, CBS, and NBC. They knew what the real story was. Some other people got ruined. Senator Edward Gurney, because he pointed out repeatedly in the Irwin Committee that it was a totally unimportant incident. And so they just simply charged him with misuse of campaign funds, ruined him. 4 years later, dropped the charges after he was $500,000 in debt and a ruined man. Senator Thomas Dodd, they ruined him because he crossed Fulbright, or Senator Halfbright, or whatever you prefer. But he's a Rhodes Scholar, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. And then Senator Keating of New York blew the whistles on the Cuban crisis, and that crossed the Fulbright group also. Look how they got rid of him. A guy whose his official home was in Massachusetts, actually living in Vienna, Virginia, ran for the Senate in New York and was elected, and his name was Robert Kennedy. Can you figure that one out? Lincoln was one. Nixon wasn't the only one that ever turned against him. Lincoln came to town, and he found out through the Constitution he didn't have to buy his money from the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, really. The Rockefellers weren't around at that time, the Rothschilds. And so he started printing the greenbacks, just like the Congress is supposed to. Cheated them out of about $40 billion in interest. And the Secretary of War at that time was Stanton, and Stanton arranged for the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State to all get shot in one night. They shot Abraham Lincoln, they wounded the Secretary of State, but the one that was to kill Andrew Johnson, the Vice President, got drunk and he never made it there. So Stanton was a little upset when he got there and found him alive. And so Andrew Johnson, now President, fired Stanton, the Secretary of War. Under the law then, Stanton, the Secretary of War, would have been the President. He fired him, and he can do that. But then the House voted a 2/3 majority to impeach Johnson, and the Senate was only 1 vote short of impeaching him. They were 1 vote short. I thought that was going to happen to Mr. Nixon, but it didn't. Well, who are they in the United States government today? Well, very interesting. Don't have time to go through them all, but in Mr. Reagan's cabinet, there are approximately 72 members of the Council of Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission. We'll hit them in the high places. Secretary of State Haig and 7 of his assistant secretaries and 9 of his ambassadors. Secretary of Defense Weinberger and 5 of his undersecretaries and assistant secretaries. And Secretary of Treasury Regan and 16 members of the Presidential Economic Advisory Board, and the chairman of the board is George Shultz, Council of Foreign Relations. And Director of CIA William Casey and his Deputy Director Mr. Inman, and the Secretary of Commerce Baldridge, and the Secretary of Interior West, and Health and Education or Health and Health Services Schweiker, and the Governors J. Rockefeller and of New West Virginia and Thompson of Illinois, and the Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, and let's see, 19 other senators, and 9 congressmen, 7 executives of Time Life Incorporated, the New York Times, 22 of their executives, Newsweek and the Washington Post, they're one and the same, 16 of their executives, CBS Television Radio 6, NBC 2, ABC 3, and of the big names and top reporters and commentators on radio and television, there are 22 of them, for a few, David Brinkley, Dan Rather, Barbara Walters, etc. Labor unions, the president of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, and in the military, commander of NATO, General Rogers, and chief of staff of the Army, Mr. Meyer. Well, many people are speaking out against this whole operation. First, I would like to quote Goldwater. He wrote in a book, "The Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, that's education, and ecclesiastical, that's religion." Pat Robertson, CBN, said, "It is absolutely vital that we take control of the United States government away from the CFR and the Trilateral Commission." 13th of April, 1976, on the Public Broadcasting System television, and Mr. Charles Morgan, I knew exactly who he was when I tuned in. He's the director of the American Civil Liberties Union operations. And by the way, the ACLU drafted the Humanism Manifesto in 1933 for the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, and now became the Aspen Institute. And he said he was totally disillusioned with the ACLU, and he concluded this way, strong language: "I am convinced that the American government is a conspiracy against the best interest of the American people." David Rockefeller, the 9th of March, 1981, in a farewell speech to Mr. McNamara as he was leaving the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to go out and take over the Bank of America. I want to read you part of that speech. You didn't read this in any of your controlled news media. David Rockefeller is not happy. "The world which we work to construct is now threatened. The gravity of this moment, when Mr. McNamara and others are about to leave their post while a new administration re-examines American foreign policy, aid is great, and the threat is great. If we're going to serve the international institutions that we put in place, the moment is now or never. For the struggle between the old guard and the new is going to go far beyond the reduction of capital appropriations." That means money going to the money group. "It is going to endanger the new world order, which we have based on an alliance between Wall Street and Washington. While we men of firms and banking organizations, international channels of economy and raw materials, the government is now building its own diplomatic and economic bridges between Washington and the rest of the world." Well, I thought that was supposed to do all the time. By our methods, our government contributes to the stability and economic growth of the world and our multinational benefits. When it is necessary, they contribute to their political support. They do that. Now, radical conservatives are attempting to destroy all that in seeking first and foremost to serve the national interest of the United States, end quote. Man, I'd love to hear him talk like that. Well, we'll have to close off. By the way, before I forget it, I have a list of the 72 members of Reagan's cabinet. They're back there and they're free. Pick up one. And, well, you got to remember that God has everything under control. It's very clear in the Bible principles that at the beginning of this age, God came first in the natural, the man Jesus Christ, to establish a spiritual kingdom. Do you get the picture? He came in the natural to establish a spiritual kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world, my kingdom is in your midst. But now, at the end of this age and the beginning of the next age, God is coming spiritually into the many-membered body of Christ to establish a natural kingdom right here on earth. Proverbs 16, verse 9, it's repeated in Psalms, "Man plans his way, but God directs his steps." God has everything under control. Beautiful. Now, I'll close with an incident that occurred. A man that had quit the McNamara administration as an assistant secretary in the Defense Department said that when he got back, he was a Christian, says, "When I get back to my home state, people are going to ask me what it's like to be in a position of power in the federal government." And he says, "I'm going to tell them it's about like a log floating down the Potomac River, and on this log you find tens of thousands of ants, and each ant thinks he's driving." And he said, "I knew that I was driving at least twice." Well, You don't have to worry about it. This whole system is going to collapse. The book of Revelation makes it very clear that Babylon, the Antichrist religion, and the Antichrist central banking system will fall, and great will be that fall. So praise the Lord. One of these times, very shortly, I can see them meeting somewhere, and they can say, well, we have absolute control. Our man is now heading up the one world government. No one can buy or sell unless they have a number, and our computers control that. Now we have absolute control. Men, we did it. And then you can see them jump up with their eyes bugging out, and somebody will shout, did you hear that trumpet? Hallelujah. Glory to God. Well, that's the end, and I ran a little over. Any questions? And we'll try to... Oh, the question. So it'd be on the tape. Investment of money. Temporarily, again, I want to remind you, the Bible warns you specifically about in the last days, you do not buy gold and silver. Because it says in the last days they'll throw their gold and silver in the streets because it will not fill their bellies nor quench their thirst. The book of Revelation says if you want some gold, you can trade about a quart of wheat for about a week's wages. So right off the top of your head, the best thing to invest in right now would be long-term storage food. Because you can't lose. Food is going to go up. It increased 30% last year. That's better than you can do in most money funds or anything else. And it'll probably double this year. Now, you can buy food that can be stored up to 15 years. Long-term storage food. Probably more nutritious than the garbage you get in the cans around here. If you're interested, we might give you some of the titles. I saw one of the names on a bottle of vitamins in the room upstairs, Neo-Life, and Arrowhead Farms in Texas, and all those. Those are Christian organizations. We'll get to you in a minute. And besides, if you like gold, or very shortly, you can sell some of the food and have all the gold you want. But if it doesn't turn out like we're talking about, don't worry about it. You can't eat the gold, but you can sure eat that long-term storage food. So it's a no-lose situation. You just can't lose. Also, if we end up with a currency switch, you might want to start saving coins. Because it'll take a long time before they can convert these machines around here to quit taking the coins we have, and they may not. So coins may be one. You can't lose. You can be able to spend them anyway. So you might be a good shot to start saving some coins. And if it doesn't work out, well, I can still turn them in. They're still currency. You can't lose on that one either. Now, for investments, if you want a temporary investment, is to invest in treasury bills or treasury notes. And you can invest for as short a period of time as 91 days. Stay out of the money fund market. It's a rip-off, just like the gold operation. If you have any property in large cities, 200,000 people or more, sell it but quick and get out. The cities are an abomination to the Lord, and they're going to explode very shortly, not with thermonuclear activity, but riots. Because the AFL-CIO controls the Teamsters, and when they quit shipping food in, you can see what's going to happen in the cities. If they shot each other for 5 gallons of gas, you can imagine what they're going to do when they run out of food. They have no more than about 2 or 3 days of food stored in any city and any warehouses all over the area. The next best investment is to buy productive land and pure water. Jim McKeever recommends that you buy that land at least 350 miles from any big city. That's about a gas tank's gas away of any car, so that they can't get to you. But I don't go for this thing of shooting people when they come after food. I go for giving them a sandwich and then share the bread of life with them. And if you're interested in the market, then it's communications and transportation, and that's it, communications, transportation. Because this gospel is going to be preached, and if you can find anything that a new technology involving fiber optics, man, get on board. If you want to know a couple of companies exactly, that would be National Cash Register, TWR, Digital Corporation. I'd steer clear of IBM right now. But those I just named are manufacturing the equipment that makes the buying and selling with a number work. And we're going to be buying and selling with a number. So it's a good investment. And I could give you some more specifics if you're interested in them. Is that what you had in mind? Brother back there, Morris, and then well, if 72 people can't rip you off, I don't know how many it'll take. The question was, is President Reagan ripping us off? Well, maybe Governor Reagan or President Reagan may not be, but his 72 Rockefellerites certainly are. Mr. Horowitz Was it Horowitz? No, that's not right. Anyway, he's a well-known writer, appeared on the 700 Club a while back. Novak, Mr. Novak, well-known writer. He's published a book, The Reagan Revolution, and he said he didn't know whether to call it the Reagan Revolution or the Bush Rebellion. And he points out that Reagan is the only honest man in the whole cabinet outside of Mr. Reagan, James Watt, just those two. Of course, he has some like Herb Ellingwood that are special advisors and some of the others. So you can see why the Antichrist system is after James Watt. He's born-again tongue speaker. Well qualified to be Secretary of Interior because he was once Deputy Secretary of Interior. I think I made a mistake a while ago. The fellow Bowdridge is the Secretary of Commerce, not Interior. Yes, not much Mr. Reagan can do about it. You know, even John Kennedy complained about that. That the president really doesn't have much power. Mr. Kissinger said that when he became the most popular man in the United States, according to Roper Poll, for 3 consecutive years. And right after he became Secretary of State, they said, "Aren't you sorry that you can't be President of the United States? See, he's foreign born, so he can't be." And he blasted said, "Oh no," says the power of that office is much too limited. He was more powerful as Secretary of State than he would have been if he was President. Yes, sir. I don't know of anyone. I could go down through the congressmen and senators and see. But there you are. You got a Rhodes Scholar running for governor. He may not be a member of the organization, but he's been to their on-the-job training school. Who? Yeah, you can pick them out when the news media. See, when the news media, the ones that I named, start supporting somebody, I'm against them already. Because I know who they're for. All that. The lady here, and then we'll come to you.
This Rhodes Scholar, I've read about the Illuminati on the tell here and that.
Sure. Yeah.
Does that mean that it's still great in that church?
Absolutely. The Episcopal Church is a member of the National Consulate Church. So is the United Methodist, most of the Presbyterians, except for the one that just broke out, and the Salvation Army that just broke out. You can run down through the list, sure. In the beginning of the National Consulate of Churches, there were 29 members that were also corresponding members in one of the communist organizations or subversive organizations listed on the Attorney General's list. In fact, former Senator McGovern right now is going all over the country lecturing to the Lawyers Guild. It's listed as a subversive organization on the Attorney General's list. You couldn't get in the military if you belonged to it, and yet he served as a senator. Do you know who the communist representative is now that McGovern, Church, By, and Javits are gone? Ted Kennedy. When Castro has something to say, Ted Kennedy pops up and the puppet starts talking. McGovern used to be, but now it's Ted Kennedy. That if you have something you don't need to live on and you can convert it to something that you may need to live, you better start converting. This may happen. See, we've had a major depression every 50 years. I mentioned that the other day. And the last one began in 1920. You had 50 years. This one began in 1970. Then it's just like in 1920, it got pretty good down, and then it started a big peak back up in the market, and then 1929, the bottom fell out. We're right at the point the bottom ought to fall out most any day. In fact, it's already fallen out. There are more savings and loans have failed in the last year than in the deepest time of depression. More farm loans are in arrears and delinquent than any time during the Depression. And, you can go on. The government is taking 70% of all available funds just to pay for the interest on the national debt, leaving only less than 30% for business to cooperate on. And you see it's just going to go on and on. The thing has to collapse. And it will collapse, and great will be the fall. It'll continue. There really won't be much change, except when the Depression is over, the banks intend to have control of everything. And I want to warn you, if you have a house or some major property that you're depending on almost paid off, you better pay it off. Or if you can't, go borrow some cotton picking much on it that the banks won't be able to take it back because you'll owe them more than it's worth. That's the best way to be, because if you don't owe very much, they're going to take your property first because they can sell it for a big profit. But when the collapse comes and you owe them more than it's worth, they're not going to bother you. They just want somebody to stay there and take care of it. So the best way to be is to not owe anybody or owe so cotton picking much that they won't touch you. Well, they're doing that. That's what the interest rate does. 22%. Can you imagine any business in the United States can make a profit when most of the profit margin was down around 10% return, and now they have to pay, 17%, I guess, or 16% the other day? There's no way you can do it. That's the reason. I have an excellent tape by J.C. Lewis, the head of the Central Western Independent Farmers, and he pointed out, and it's an excellent 90-minute talk on how they got control of our government, how they got control of our money, and how they got control of our energy, and now they're moving to control the food, and that's the reason the little farmers are being forced out, and the banks are controlling the whole thing and the whole bit. And once they got the food, then the so-called food shortage, all that'll be over with, because they'll mark it all up, and they'll have absolute control. That's their plan. I don't know that it's going to work out. It's going to be interesting to see. Yes. Your neighbor did, the lady back here. Who? Oh, Haig. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Boy, you'll have to get up early in the morning to get ahead of Haig. Alexander Haig was exactly right when he went to the White House and took over when Reagan had been shot, because the vice president was not in town. He was down in Texas, and not the sequence to accession to office, but the sequence of accession to control of the government in the interim is the Secretary of State. And besides, he's the only one in town that knew where the bathroom was. The rest of them didn't know anything. They just got into town. They didn't know where anything was. Well, man, Haig run the White House for Nixon, because they had Nixon all locked up and incapacitated. So even if he was out of order, he would have been the logical one to go over and show him what to do. And besides, he's talking to Bush. They're on the same team. They're both members of the Trilateral Commission, the Council of Foreign Relations. They're old buddies. They meet regular over at David's house. There was a lady here. Yes, and then don't let me forget you now. We'll come across. You'd have to, if they're municipal bonds. The question was about long-term tax-free bonds. If they're municipal bonds, utilities, real trouble. Real trouble. Cities, many of them are bankrupt now, and they're going to get worse. And thanks to Ralph Nader and Jane Fonda and all the others, they're wiping the utilities out, too. We're going to have massive electrical blackouts probably this year, certainly 1984, because there's no way. If you live out in California, the last 2 years, they've rotated blackouts out there. They don't have enough electricity to carry the whole thing, so they black out Marin County one night and another county the next night, and they pass it around. And we're not going to have enough electricity. Well, you know, why do they say thermonuclear is not safe? Because the Rockefellers own all the oil, and they own all the coal. They don't care how many people die. They just want to sell all that old stuff before they bring out the uranium, and they own most of the uranium. That's the reason that thermonuclear power is not safe. It's safe everywhere in the world except the United States. Oh, the question. Will Mr. Nixon ever be vindicated? And I'm glad you mentioned the word vindicated. I received a tape from Brother, it was in his Voice of the Overcomer, and that Ken Copeland's letter. The Voice of the Believer. The Voice of the Believer, yeah. But anyway, Ken Copeland's newsletter, and this was right after Mr. Nixon had been forced out of office, and Brother Copeland received a prophecy, and he doesn't know anything about what we're talking about. Although Ken and I talked about it briefly one time in St. Louis in 1972, I guess it was, that I could see some things happening. But the prophecy was, as God spoke, Mr. Nixon was my servant, and he will be vindicated before he departs this earth. And a prophet by the name of Bill Vanderbilt, a veterinarian, a very reliable prophet, got almost the same response within about 2 or 3 days of the convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, that Mr. Nixon would be vindicated in his lifetime. It was found in Atlanta just last year in a poll that if Mr. Nixon ran against Carter, Mr. Nixon would have been elected by 76% of the votes in Atlanta. And Carter came from Atlanta. Do any of you know Judge Kermit Bradford? He was a judge in Fulton County, that's Atlanta, for 17 years, and he served under Jimmy Carter. And when I found out who Carter was, and before he ran for office, found he was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and so I asked Kermit, he's an international director of Full Gospel, so I asked him, I said, what about this fellow Carter? I knew quite a lot. And he said, Speed, you can be sure of one thing. The biggest lie I ever told you is I'll never lie to you. He said the guy is a compulsive liar. And that's what the assistant governor of Georgia said. Maddox, what's his name? I've forgotten. But you know, Axhandle Maddox, that was the governor before. He said that Carter was a compulsive liar. And he is. So that was another characteristic that the computer said they ought to have. So Jimmy Carter fit that one too. He fit all the characteristics. So yes, Mr. Nixon was never disgraced in the eyes of the world. It was only in the United States that he was disgraced. Any others, and then we really... Yeah, oh, sister, I forgot you. Thank you. The question is, do I think there'll be any improvement for the people in the United States? And you're talking about economic. No, I don't. I think it's going to get worse. And I really think it's going to get a lot worse. It's going to get worse fast, as it did around 1929. And it won't begin to get better till somewhere around the year 2001, somewhere out in that range. And what comes out of that's going to be most interesting. I expect a regime by Christians to come out of it. Well, I'm not going to call what it is. I'm just telling you what's going to happen. You can put anything you want on it, whether it's the judgments of the nation, the wrath of God, or it's not going to be a hot time in the old town. The happy days are not here again. Oh, they're just power hungry. As you know, you've heard the saying, and it's so true. And of course, we quoted the scripture that the love of money is the root of all evil. And it sure is. The power hungry. What do you think drove Napoleon? What do you think drove Alexander the Great and Kublai Khan, Hitler, and all that bunch? It's just the hunger for controlling somebody else, and the power behind it is Satan himself, Antichrist spirit. You see no man after the flesh. It's the spirit behind the whole thing that is the continuity. It's Satan that's running the lady in the way in the back. Did somebody up here and can tell me? Oh, I mentioned that earlier in the talk, that the Falkland Islands is a neat maneuver for the Russians to get the South American countries to all turn against the United States, because we have to line up with England. Any law-abiding country would have to. And, of course, it was to get about 3/4 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Navy all the way down in the South Atlantic, so that if Russia chooses to move into the Middle East, which she's ready to do, there won't be much over there to keep her from doing it. And the only one that's going to win is going to be Russia and the Falkland Island operation. We certainly won't come out winner. We're going to get the dirty end of the stick either way it goes. And that's deliberate, too. Yes, brother. Oh, don't get some. The reason Russia will invade the Middle East is to cut off the oil to the NATO nations and the common market, because over 90% of all their oil comes from the Middle East, and once you cut it off, then Russia would take Western Europe and all of that area just waiting around till they use their oil up. Just that simple. And it's very simple to do, because they got them surrounded. If you're really interested in the details of how this will work out, get the tape back there, the Russia, the United States, well, it really ought to be Russia, North America, the United States and Canada, and Israel in prophecy. And we go through in detail, verse by verse, Ezekiel 37 through 39, and also Isaiah 19 and Amos, 9, 10, all those scriptures, and Joel, and all the others. See, there's a battle of Jehoshaphat, or Jezreel, is coming up. There's no such thing as a blood and guts battle called Armageddon. It's a spiritual battle, and you're in it now. It's kingdom against kingdom that Jesus prophesied. Sure do. Yeah. It sure fits, doesn't it? You'll find a lot of these things will fit in the Bible. And as I said, most everything I talk about is related to confirming the fact that we're in the time of the end of this age. Because when you can identify an outfit this clear, then it must be just another sign. And that's all it is to me, is just another sign. But also knowing who they are, then I can begin to plan on what to do. And I'm sorry I didn't have time on the tape to answer the question. People would throw up the arms and say, now that I know this, what do I do? The Bible says you've got to be led of the Spirit. Those who are led of the Spirit are the sons of God. Those that are led with the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. There's no way I can tell you what you ought to do. Because it's a many-membered body, and each member has a different body function within the body of Christ. Billy Graham says if you find two Christians doing the exact same thing, one of them missed God. And that's true. So, somebody said, yeah, but you got two hands. Well, you try to put the right one over on the left and see how well it works. You got two kidneys. Well, maybe so. But you don't know. But anyway, there might be some duplication here and there. But generally speaking, the analogy that Paul gave of the body. It's so sad to me as I go around, people say, did you hear about brother so-and-so? Bless God, he's a man of God, and he's doing so-and-so. And I'm not led to do that. I must have missed God. Oh, forget it. Or then they'll come up and say, you heard about brother so-and-so, he's doing that, and bless God, he sure missed God, didn't he? My answer is, that's between him and God. I can't judge it. I don't know what the Lord's telling him to do. Well, thank you very much. It's certainly been a blessing being with you and sharing with you, and I appreciate your tolerance and your patience. Those that are led by the Spirit of God, they are.
This is the end of this message. Our website is www.lakehamiltonbiblecamp.com and lhbconline.com. There are many free audio files there. It's like going to Bible school at home.